Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.
Good morning, everybody. I think I'm going to do a little bit shorter one today that is a repeated conversation that I have. Originally, way back at the beginning, I did an episode about introversion versus extroversion. And I talk a lot about what extroversion actually is as a nervous system, what introversion actually is as a nervous system, the ways in which introverts have been pathologized, the ways in which, especially in American culture, extroverts are aggrandized and often in ways where they're not actually as helpful as people think that they are. American culture views extroverted behaviors as successful behaviors, and it's not necessarily true. But that's also not to demonize them. It's a different type of nervous system. But there's this one part of introversion that I think everyone struggles with describing because we're attempting to escape all of the negative connotations that have been built in. The word introversion itself is deeply connected to the idea of being shy, which is not necessarily accurate. There are extroverts who are shy. It's connected to the idea of being too sensitive or being afraid or not being aggressive or not being outgoing or not having leadership skills and being a follower, blah, blah, blah. Nothing wrong with being a follower, but also that's not inherently true about introverts. Introverts make really, really good leaders. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking it through with clients. And so I wanted to peel this one part off about the language around introversion, what the nervous system actually is, and the language that I developed. It's not necessarily elegant. Maybe there will be a better language at some point. And, but I wanted to peel this one piece off about the language that we use and what it means to be an introvert. So there's the book out about the HSP, or the highly sensitive person. And that is not necessarily inherently a negative connotation, although being someone who was told over and over and over by my mother how sensitive I was and I was too sensitive and blah, 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 which was utter bullshit given the egregiously abusive things that she was doing. Right? Being accused of being too sensitive, just to give you an example, is around the fact that because we live in Oregon, it was kind of cold, our cats would like to climb up on the wheel of the car to get near the engine and to feel the warmth. And sometimes they'd fall asleep on the wheel of the car, and they're also out of the rain or whatever. And when we would leave to drive, I would always be very concerned, like, hey, look out for the cat. And my dad, who was still pretty sick and young at that time, psychologically sick, would be like, get out of the way or it won't. So there were multiple times in which our pet, we would hear it scream and feel its body crush under the tire. And my mother would force me to bury it because she would say, well, you're the boy, it's your job to bury the animals, right? So take that as context, that I was being accused of being too sensitive. So maybe it's just my own bias, but even the language of a highly sensitive person, I dislike. And I don't think it's ill meant. I think the person who wrote that book has a deep empathy and understanding and compassion. But I'm going to tell you the language that I've settled on because I think it's just scientifically more accurate. What I call people like myself and other people, and I will acknowledge, I'll give you the caveat that I'm probably biased because I am an introvert and I have been offended and have spent a lifetime pushing off negative definitions and having to learn to appreciate the ways in which we have superpowers that are of great value to society. But my description of a highly sensitive person or an introvert is a high density nervous system. And this is very, very accurate. So what this means is take any given environment. We all have a brain, we all have a central nervous system. It's a given that, for example, there are some animals who see outside of our visible range. There are some animals who navigate by echolocation. There are some animals who don't see what we see. There are most animals, their sense of smell vastly greater than ours. And what this really means is what we call reality, or our perception of reality, is limited by the spectrum, by how broadly we perceive everything that actually is, right? And so if you get into infrared or you get into radio waves, et cetera, humans don't perceive it, right? It's there, doesn't mean it's not there, but we don't perceive it. And scientifically, as we learn to interact with those things and we learn to leverage those things to our benefit, it's like, well, yeah, a radio wave is a real thing, right? It's just that you don't perceive it until someone builds a radio with an antenna that's capable of receiving that energy and translating that energy into sound waves that have been coded to be interpreted as voice by your ear or whatever. So it basically gets funneled into something that your nervous system is able to receive and interpret, right? So essentially, if I break down what an extrovert is and what an introvert is in a way that's dismissive of extroverts, and I'll tell you that that's not all extroverts are, right? We don't need to like limit who and what they are and what their capabilities are. What it really means is that an introvert is someone with a high density nervous system. Introverts literally perceive way more in any given situation. Their nervous system is taking in this massively augmented, far, far larger picture of what's happening around them and energies that are occurring and micro expressions on people's faces and, blah, 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 than the average extrovert. The average extrovert doesn't feel worn out and doesn't feel tired with social interactions and actually seeks stimulus because their nervous system is not perceiving everything that's going on in a situation. So I remember when I was recording, there's a couple things that I think about. There's a mic called an SM57, which is like a super standard mic, but I worked with a producer who used to joke that you could practically hammer nails with it. It was so solid. You can drop it and it's fine. And essentially it has this very, very robust membrane in it that receives the airwaves and translates that into electrical signal, right? But you can put it in front of a Marshall amp and crank the amp to 11, as it were, and that microphone's going to be fine. But it also is not going to take in nearly as much complexity and density as, say, a ribbon mic. And that ribbon mic has that thin little filament in it that's so sensitive to the environment that you can put it in a concert hall and take in this very rich, very dense, beautiful, high detail image of the sound. When I say image, I mean the sound in that room. And an SM57 is not even going to begin to do that. You put it on one single instrument at the right place, you can get a pretty good recording, right? So you have that microphone that takes in a far more dense amount of data and information from the environment. That's what an introvert is. Not somebody who just avoids social situations because they're afraid of people or they're shy. Now, after being criticized and shamed and not really understanding what their nervous system does, they might have learned to avoid social situations. I mean, I can't stand big crowds. It's so overwhelming for me. I put a big crowd with a bunch of loud music and like people running around, like, oh, like I can force myself to stay there for 2 or 3 hours, but I'm dissociated sometimes within minutes. If a place is really, really loud, my brain dissociates and I'm sort of like checked out, right? So that ribbon mic, that ability to take in a mass density of information it's not just that the introverted nervous system or the highly sensitive nervous system, or as I'm calling it, the high density nervous system, it's not just that it's capable of taking in a much broader spectrum of all of the information in the system. It is also that it takes it in and then it stores it. Like all you have this mass of data about, this person feeling that way and that person's facial expression when that person told that joke and who that person is and why they might have told that joke and all the noise and the sounds that are going on, blah, blah, blah. And the high density nervous system is taking all of that data in, but then all of that data gets stored. And so you have this massive glut of data in every situation that you go into. Why do introverts seek quiet and seek to get away from crowds? It's not because we're like, oh my God, I'm scared. Oh, I'm shy. I don't like people. No, it's because there comes a point where you can't take in any more data, and you're also trying to process a bunch of very complex, very dense data. Again, I think about, for example, when I worked in recording, it's like you can record at 44.1, you can record at, well, I forget, up to 92K or whatever. So what that literally means is if the microphone is sensitive enough and you're recording at a much higher density, right? The computer is taking a snapshot of much finer split seconds to capture every minute detail of the sound and what's going on. You will notice that as you're storing those music tracks or whatever you're recording on your computer memory starts filling up really fast. Because where at 44.1 or at whatever regular density, something is stored at the lower density, you might be tripling or times 10 or times 100 or times 1,000 the number of gigabytes that one performance is. And then you're packing all of that into, like, forget about different performances and different tracks in that performance and like, oh, this is the cello and this is blah, blah, blah. Like, how fast do you think your computer memory is going to get completely overwhelmed? And then at some point, just like happens when your computer gets too full, the drive gets too full, everything starts malfunctioning and programs are not running well, and the computer starts telling you, I can't operate, because it has nowhere to think what it needs to think. It has no space to think what it needs to think about what's happening now, because there's all this data stored, right? So this is the same thing with the high density nervous system. There comes a point when we have a glut of data that we need to think through, make sense of, discard, go, well, that's not really important, and blah. We have to do that. And we can't do it while more data is constantly pouring in and going stimuli, 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 stimuli. You can't do it. It's not possible. So the high density nervous system will just dissociate. Even worse, if there's someone like myself who spent a lifetime being insulted by their parents and being called too sensitive, and my dad was not proud of me because I couldn't handle the level of stimuli that he could, which, by the way, he's also an introvert, but he was very, very narcissistic and very detached from his own experiences. So he just very narcissistically, arrogantly bowled his way through. Even though he was quite a perceptive person, he came off as extremely lacking perception because he had to be dissociated and detached from most of his interactions. And so people found him abrasive and insulting and blah, blah, blah. But he actually is an introvert who had suffered so much trauma and shame that he had just learned to detach from his state. And so you take someone like me, it's like, not only do you have this glut of information, but you also then have a bunch of shame dumping into your system and a feeling like, oh, like this is what my problem is, and I'm not as successful because I can't stay at the conference for as long, as I'm not as aggressive in reaching out to people, and I'm not joking and laughing with people at the bar, and all of that stuff happens because, again, in American culture, we really aggrandize um, extroverts and we pathologize introverts, right? But it's just a high density system. It's a high density nervous system. It takes in way more data and it gets glutted and filled up way faster, which means introverts or the highly sensitive person or the high density nervous system needs to go away and spend some time processing and spend some time offloading and dumping and quieting down all of that data so that they can come back and be present to whatever the new experience is. Right? Makes sense. It's just scientific. It's almost mathematical. It's just structural. It's just physics. It doesn't mean anything about you or me or anyone else. It's the high density nervous system. So I don't like the highly sensitive person because of the word sensitive, and maybe that's just my trauma bias. And I don't like introversion because the high density nervous system is not necessarily internally oriented. It has to spend time internally oriented to process and digest all of that data that comes in. But we're just as excited about experiencing external data. We seek it just as much. We love it just as much, but we take it more seriously and we take more of it in, right? So when people are like, oh, they need to go away and, blah, blah, it's like, yeah, no, we're not going away because we have a problem with reality. We're going away because we take in way more reality than you do. Way more. Astronomically more than you do. Right? So now this is my frustration and my bias in the situation. That I've experienced so much condescension and shaming and abuse from people who believe in extroversion as a superior state, that some of how I describe extroversion is condescending and insulting. And I'll just own that by just saying it to you. And I can tell you what's beautiful about extroverts. Right? So let's go the other direction. If you take a low density nervous system that compresses everything, doesn't see the complexity of the situation, doesn't take it in. Like if you really hang out with an extrovert, if they're severely extroverted and also narcissistic, you'll hear them compress experiences into this thing that you're like, that's what you got from this? Like you were not paying attention at all. Like you didn't see anything, right? So now I'm talking about an extreme where if you have a very extroverted friend who's also narcissistic and a bit detached, they'll tell a really off-color and insulting joke. And let's say they tell a really off-color joke, a racial joke about a Black person, and there's someone in the group who's married to a Black person, and there's a couple nervous laughs, and there's one person who laughs really boisterously, but they're uncomfortable. They just did it because they don't know what to do. And there's a couple people who actually are racist, and they think it's really funny. And then the person who's married to the person of color doesn't laugh at all, and they're really uncomfortable. And other people are kind of uncomfortable. A couple of people shovel off, and blah, blah, blah. The hardcore extrovert will just be like, well, everybody laughed. Like nobody said anything. It was fine. It was hilarious. Because they're completely unaware of all the data in the situation. Like they're not getting it. They're not hearing anything. So when you see these people and we get really frustrated with them, we're like, what the fuck were you like? Were you not there? They're not there in the way that a high density nervous system is. They're not there. They're not there. They're not seeing what's in the situation. They're not perceiving it. And some people perceive it a little bit. So there are extroverts who, are paying attention and they perceive it a little bit and they get that happened, and they'll try to avoid feeling shame or embarrassment, or they'll try to avoid taking responsibility. But I'm like, well, I don't care. Like a bunch of people did laugh. I don't care if a couple of people laughed. And you can hear those people that try to avoid feeling the shame that there's something that they miss that they don't really understand. And that's another weakness of extroverts, because they don't feel the impact in their body and in their nervous system of all of the other things that go on out there. When you tell an extrovert, hey, this happened, they have a tendency to be very condescending and dismissive because they don't want to acknowledge that there's something outside of their perception. They don't want to feel stupid, right? And so they'll be very, not always, but in the ones that are more narcissistic, they'll be very condescending and dismissive because the truth is under their condescension of like, oh my God, you're so sensitive, and like, oh, that didn't happen. Under all that crap is the fear that, oh, if I really barely see it or don't see it, I might be stupid. I might be dull and oh, right? I might be the obtuse one. And they don't want to look at that. So, especially because it doesn't impact their bodies. One of the strong points, but also struggles for the high density nervous system is they take so many things in that we're sometimes excruciatingly aware that many people are having many different experiences, sometimes not even the experience I have. So you can come to an introvert or a high density nervous system and say, hey, I had this experience. And a high density nervous system will be like, yeah, I get that. Like, and I get that I might not understand it because they know that that's happening all the time. And by the way, for extroverts, the reason you tend to win arguments and debates about what's true with introverts is because introverts know that they don't always know and they're not always aware. So they're capable of going, yeah, there might be something here that I'm not aware of, because they have a whole experience and they watch people not be aware of shit all the time. And there's a humility of like, well, people are not aware of stuff all the time. And so I might not be aware of stuff. So if an extrovert is like, oh, you didn't understand what was going on, an introvert will go, yeah, that's very possible that that's true. But the problem is the extrovert is not aware of not being aware, and they're not aware of other people missing things. And so they're absolutely convinced that they're aware of everything when they're aware of less than other people are aware. So then the extrovert wall, you're like, oh my God, no, people didn't think at all. And they'll be totally self-assured that that's true. And they'll win an argument with the high density nervous system because the high density nervous system is always going to go, look, I know that my perception is limited. I watch people being limited all the time. And I know that I'm often, well, that's because they're aware of a far greater, far more dense slice of reality. And they're also aware that if they can watch people not seeing everything all the time, they know that they themselves don't even begin to see the entire density. Okay. And so that's a failing of that happens between low density and high density nervous system. Is a low density nervous system that compresses things into these simple interpretations of reality tend to win arguments about what happened because they're far more confident that they saw everything because they've never experienced enough data to realize that they don't see everything, right? And also, something that is beautiful about extroverts is that they are very externally oriented and they are extremely resilient. And they can fight through stress like you cannot imagine. Stress that will take a high density nervous system and shut it down. And right, let's take a scenario where I really like extroverts and their way of being. They're fun, exciting people because they're always looking for stimuli, right? Let's say you have a company and there's some negotiations you want to do with a government. Let's say you want to do some project, but you need to negotiate with some government and there's some political ill will and there's a lot of complexity and there's some people who are pissed off, but it really is the best thing to do. You're going to develop a new crop, like whatever it is you're going to do, right? But you know that you need someone to be the face of the company and to go negotiate with Congress and to speak on it publicly and blah, blah, blah. And there's going to be people who are butthurt and people who don't understand and people who are just haters and blah, blah, blah. You want the low density nervous system to do that job. You want to give them that job and say, look, this is our presentation to the public. You know, this is how we want to do this. We want someone to do the media. We want someone to go, speak in Congress. We want someone who can, push back on haters and explain that the way they're perceiving this situation isn't correct, et cetera, et cetera. typically a lot of high density nervous systems are going to do an amazing job in a short term, and then they're going to blow fuses because the amount of stimuli and the intensity of the anger and the intensity of emotional, right? So the high density nervous system doesn't deal with long-term intensity. It'll just dissociate and blow fuses, and it'll dissociate and detach. And then high density people actually appear far dumber than anyone else because they've gone offline. It's not just that they're not perceiving as much. They have literally shut down as a system, and they're kind of not perceiving anything. Right? So in that situation, you want the low density, externally oriented, stimuli seeking person. And in this way, extroverts are amazing, besides the fact that they're super fun and loving people and they love to do fun things, et cetera, right? And high density nervous system people, we're attracted to low density nervous system people, or let's say there's high density nervous system people and high stimuli nervous system people, right? The high stimuli people need the stimulation because their nervous system doesn't trigger as fast. It's not taking in the data. So they're a lot more fun, right? Because they're just like doing fun, wacky things and they don't get overwhelmed. That's a superpower. We love that. High density nervous systems love those people. But we have to get over the bullshit, especially in American culture, of the idea that the high density nervous system, the introverted people, are somehow weaker or less capable or whatever. Yeah, there are specific situations where our nervous systems are going to get overwhelmed. But what's the superpower? Well, if you want someone, I mean, you want a sign of intelligence, it's the ability to recognize not super obvious, screaming, raging, obvious patterns. People who recognize soft, subtle, quiet patterns over long periods of time can help the human race in very profound ways because other people are not seeing it, right? But high density nervous system people, like, that's literally our superpower, is that we recognize subtle patterns that are built out over long periods of time that other people, A, they're not taking in the density of data to see that subtle pattern, and B, they're not digesting data, right? The extrovert, they have an experience and they forget it an hour later. They don't remember the density of it. They don't, because they didn't take the data in. They just have the experience and they're like, oh, wee, and then it's over and they forget it, right? So they don't recognize long-term patterns and they don't recognize subtle patterns. So the superpower of the high density nervous system is that we're really, really good at subtle long-term pattern recognition in ways that's very helpful to the human race. So, you know, there's probably a lot more that could be said about it, but I wanted to keep this one short and to really just peel off and address that one thing. What we call extroverts or low density nervous systems, they seek stimuli because they're understimulated and they need excitement and activation, and that makes a superpower for them is like, oh man, you have a long-term stressful job. They're amazing. They're amazing. Like, they can just bear up under stress on, year after year after year after year, and they get stuff done that way. And it's amazing. They get stuff done. They should have a high density nervous system advising them, because if they don't, they'll end up rolling over people and breaking shit. But they can do that. A high density nervous system person can't, right? That's their superpower. We love that. The failing of that system is a lack of an ability to recognize subtle long-term patterns, and that they're just not taking in the data. They're not taking in the breadth of the full spectrum of data. When I say full, that's not even true, because none of us are taking in the full spectrum. We don't even know what the full spectrum is, because we don't know what we don't know, right? But the superpower of the high density nervous system is the person who takes in an enormous amount of data in any given situation. It's very dense, it's very detailed, but then the challenge for us is we have to go away and process that to make sense of it. And the challenge of that is, if you put us in long-term stressful situations, we'll just blow fuses and dissociate. And then we become even less perceptive than the extrovert because we're not even there. We're just dissociated and detached and struggling to cope, right? Where the extrovert tends not to have that struggle to cope. The extrovert copes like a champ, and they're challenged in the subtlety and the profundity of their perception of things. They have a harder time really seeing everything that's going on. And the high density nervous system is very challenged in long-term stress, high stimuli or intense stimuli, but is just really amazing at getting a much broader spectrum of data to take in and the ability to make sense of it because they've been forced to practice the making sense of and digesting of it their entire lives. So I really wanted to peel that piece off and to tell you, we don't need to condescend to extroverts, right? When I call them low density nervous system, it's maybe a little insulting. Let's just call them stimulus seeking folks. Stimulus seeking nervous system, love it, right? High density nervous system, love it. They each have their strengths and weaknesses, and we're all human beings here, and introverts and extroverts fall in love with each other all the time. We're attracted to one another because we complement one another. So let's keep that in mind. But I wanted to peel that one piece off on this thing that I talk about all the time with clients. It would go a long way to rebalancing politics, business leadership, et cetera, if we begin to realize you should protect your high density folks. Don't force them to go to 8-hour meetings because they're going to dissociate. But if you want some amazing processing of information in which you can get some incredibly useful information and impactful information for your organization, let them go off and work quietly. Leave them the fuck alone. Stop making them sit in meetings and do presentations because American culture says that's what a successful person is. That's some bullshit. Don't do that because you're destroying an extremely valuable gift that comes from that high density nervous system person. All right, you guys, I love you guys. I will talk to you next time and have a great week.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.